Today I'm going to talk to you about folic acid. You have probably heard of folic acid, most commonly associated with pregnant women, but folic acid is actually important for everybody as it is a very popular water-soluble vitamin, one of the B vitamins. Folic acid is different than folate, which I realized after taking on folic acid as my presentation. And so folate is the naturally occurring B vitamin that you find in legumes and leafy greens and asparagus and vegetables like that. So folate is the naturally grown form versus folic acid is a form of folate that is synthesized for dietary supplements and put into grains, like as fortification. I'm not going to pronounce that word, but that is the technical term for folic acid, and it is not as easily metabolized as folate, which means that it can build up in the bloodstream. Folic acid is extremely important in the body, and as I mentioned before, is most important for women who are pregnant or can become pregnant because folic acid is important in cellular division or mitosis. And so we know that during pregnancy, cells are dividing more rapidly than other times of human development, and so that is why folic acid is so important at these times. Folic acid is also needed for making of DNA and other genetic material, also important during pregnancy. They all tie together. Folic acid relies on B12 to receive broken down carbons and then filter them back to the B12. So they sort of go back and forth and gain energy in this way, which means that you can't really process folic acid or folate without the combination of the B12 vitamin. All of the B vitamins sort of work together for developing red blood cells and for cellular mitosis, which is why supplements are often offered as B complex or with a combination of B12 and not just as folate or folic acid alone. The recommended daily allowances for children are 150 to 200 micrograms per day. Adults are 400 micrograms per day, and then it shoots up for pregnant women at 600 micrograms a day is the recommended amount. And for lactating women, which is, another stage of rapid cell division, and mothers who choose to breastfeed after pregnancy will still need about 500 micrograms of folic acid per day in order to provide energy for both their baby and themselves. Folic acid deficiency is the more complex issue as far as folic acid is concerned, more so than toxicity. Folic acid deficiency is not stored in our fat cells. We know that folic acid is a water-soluble vitamin, which means that we have to continue taking it each day to regulate our storage of it because it will, be excreted through the body, and so it is not stored up. Something like calcium can be stored in the bones, but folic acid must be replaced regularly in order to have efficient storage of it. The major concern of folic acid deficiency is neural tube defects that happen very early in gestational development. And so most commonly we know spina bifida is something that can result due to mothers having a lack of folic acid in the early terms of pregnancy. The other big folic acid deficiency problem that we have that occurs in people that are not pregnant is folate deficiency anemia. And as we mentioned before, we know that folic acid is extremely important in the production of red blood cells as well as other B vitamins. And so if we do not have enough folic acid in our bodies, we can't produce enough red blood cells, and that is what causes people to become anemic. The symptoms of folic acid deficiency are similar to other blood conditions. For example, pale skin, decrease of appetite, lethargy, and irritability are all things that you would see in someone who had folic acid deficiency. On the other hand, you can have too little folic acid, but you can also have too much. However, it is not as high of a concern to become toxic from folic acid. It's pretty uncommon that this would happen, but it can happen. Adults, pregnant, and lactating women should not consume more than 1,000 micrograms of folic acid or folate per day, and this is roughly equivalent to about double the amount that they need, which could really only occur if someone is taking supplements, eating foods that are high in folate, and taking in grains that are fortified with folic acid. So it is not common at all that people experience folate toxicity, and this would be them eating too many leafy greens. That doesn't really happen, but you can take too much in supplementation. Since many foods are fortified with folic acid, and it is difficult to test between B12 deficiency versus folate deficiency because they are both important in cases of anemia. So it is risky to treat a person who has anemia with either high dosage of B12 or folate, because if it is one or the other, then you can become toxic in whichever one you saturated the person with. Exceeding the upper intake through the form of folic acid can cause neurological disorders that are irreversible, and symptoms of this would be depression, psychotic behavior, trouble concentrating, fatigue, or anything else that might go into the category of neurological disorders. There are many great sources of folate, and so someone who is consuming plenty of legumes and leafy green vegetables should be good on their folate intake per day and shouldn't need to supplement with folic acid. However, cooking foods that have folic acid in them can actually destroy up to half of the folate in them. So we can remember that the recommended daily intake for adults is 400 micrograms of folic acid per day. And really great source for that is just 1 cup of lentils contains almost all of the folate you need in one day. You can also get it from raw beets, kidney beans, asparagus, broccoli, avocado, spinach, oranges, Brussels sprouts, walnuts. The word for folate in Latin is folium, which means leaf. And so, if you think about leaves and eating more leaves, you're probably getting more folate in them. And as we mentioned before, folate and folic acid are different. So I included this because these are great sources of folate, which is the naturally occurring form of folic acid. But if you want to consume folic acid, what you would need are things that are fortified or supplemented with folic acid, such as these prenatal vitamins. I have a B complex that's B12, but it has folate in it, and nutritional yeast, which is great for vegetarians because it has B12, which comes from most animal sources. And what you would notice about all three of those things that I just showed you is that not only do they include folic acid, but they also include B12. As mentioned before, they need each other to function. Folic acid and pregnancy are really the biggest connection that you want to make between taking the supplement in. Neural tube defects happen so early during pregnancy that a mother or someone who can become a mother who does not have the proper level of folic acid going into pregnancy will see complications due to this later because they were not preemptively, supplying what the developing fetus needed to develop their spine and brain. We already mentioned spina bifida, but another common neural tube defect is anencephaly, which is a baby who is born missing part of their brain, scalp, or skull. We know the Latin for anen is without, and cephaly is brain, and so this means without brain, and it is another common neurological tube defect. Lately, the U.S. has been supplementing grains such as flour with folic acid, which has caused a 28% decrease in neural tube defects and is really beneficial for preventing these because, if a mother is not planning on becoming pregnant and is aware of it and the pregnancy so early can cause neural tube defects, and so supplementing grains and other things can help prevent babies who are born with neurological defects. In summation, the best thing to do is to use preventative care, which would mean making sure that all women who are of childbearing age, and not only those who are planning to become pregnant, but anyone who could become pregnant, to make sure that their folic acid levels are regular by taking supplements, eating foods that are fortified with folic acid, or by consuming plenty of foods that were mentioned before that contain folate. I think it's really interesting that the government actually mandates the fortification of folic acid in grains because it really shows you how serious consuming enough folic acid is, that the U.S. government would actually step in and say, we have to put this in our food sources because people are not getting enough. And so in 1965, this is when folate deficiency was associated with neural tube defects, when conclusive studies were done showing that babies born with neural tube defects oftentimes had mothers who had folate deficiency throughout pregnancy. In 1992, the U.S. Public Health Service made a blanket-wide recommendation that 400 micrograms of folic acid should be consumed by any woman of childbearing age. And as I mentioned before, this is so important because 50% of pregnancies in the US are unplanned. And so this is the best thing we can do to prevent neurological tube defects. Neurological tube defects occur within the first 28 days of pregnancy. And so folic acid is just so important for anyone who could become pregnant, because that's one less thing to worry about, that you are good to go and that neurological tube defects won't be the first problem that comes to mind in unplanned pregnancy. In 1998, the US made fortification of enriched cereals mandatory at 140 micrograms of folic acid per 100 grams of enriched cereal. So right off the bat, if someone is eating something that is enriched with folic acid, such as this cereal, you have over a quarter of your daily intake right there. And in 2006, the World Health Organization published guidelines to help countries with target fortification through the use of flour that is fortified with folic acid. And so there are now more than 50 countries that the World Health Organization is trying to mandate folic acid that is supplemented in their flour, which can help prevent neurological tube defects across the world. These are all of my awesome references for this presentation. Thank you. I hope you learned something about folic acid, and make sure to take your vitamins.